To me, it means being able to explain what is so good about something that other people also enjoy, but can't explain the goodness of.
You're thinking of building a company or already run a company that is not registered, but you want to get registered. I've looked at a lot of solutions, and one of the best ones in the market right now is Doula. I reached out to Arjun, who is actually the founder of Doula.com. I asked him if he'd like to work together on the podcast. He was like, of course. Doula is sort of a platform that helps founders and businesses form and manage US companies, regardless of where they live. If someone is living in India, for example, and wants to start a company and get registered in the US, he or she can do it by using Doula.com. Doula helps in forming the company. It can be an LLC, C Corp, or you name it. Doula offers a US address and a bank account to users, which can allow you to conduct business transactions that you can receive and send payments no matter where you live in the world from the United States. And other than that, they also provide tax consultation to the users, which is an incredible feature. And Doula simplifies the process of establishing and managing a US company, and especially for founders that are not in the US. And regardless of where they live, you can get your company registered with Doula.com. To check out Doula, go to doula.com/exerton. That is DOOLA.com/EXERTON. Hey Nat, how are you? You're doing well?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this for a very long time, and I'm so glad we got the chance to do this. Let's start with who's Nat? Who are you?
Who am I? Now I just introduce myself as an author. I've wanted to get into book writing for a long time. I love writing, and I think that if you want to make a career out of being a writer, your options are basically to be a journalist, to do like a high paid newsletter, to do writing for pay, like ghostwriting, technical writing, those things, or it's to be an author. And I've always had a deep love for books and been obsessed with books, and I've read so many books and have wanted to just make this to be the thing that I could focus on making for so long. And now I can. Now I get to do it. And so that's who I am now. I'm in terms of professional stuff, I'm an author. But then outside of that, I'm a father. I'm somebody who is very just like interested in these big life questions around, what do we do? Why do we do what we do? What is the nature of our mind and consciousness and life and all of these things. And but I think at the end of the day, I love to write, and I love to have that be what fuels getting to spend time with my friends and family.
You talked about you loving books since you were very young. What do you think was the first sort of book which started that love for books for you?
I was very into books as a kid, and then it kind of fell off in middle and high school, and I read less and less. But a couple books stand out as really changing my relationship with them. The first one was in high school. I read Atlas Shrugged, and obviously very popular and relatively controversial book, but it was the first time that I had read something which was arguing something so fundamentally different to my worldview, but was arguing it in a very compelling way. And that was a really interesting experience because I came out of it having shifted my perspective on life and philosophy and a lot of things. I didn't, fully, I kind of did for a while, just like fully adopt an Ayn Rand philosophy, but it was the first kind of wake up call that, oh, books actually have incredible insights in them for how you can live as an individual, how you can be in the world. And so that was a very transformative experience. And the second one was in college. I was just living like not a good life, like very unhealthy, very self-destructive. And a friend recommended, and I felt very stuck that way. Like I felt like, oh, this is just who I am, right? This is just my life. And a friend recommended me the book The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. And this was before Atomic Habits was out. And so like that was the big habit book. And she said, maybe read this. Like if you actually want to change these things, maybe you can. And I read it and I said, like, I just said, oh my God, like maybe you actually can change things about your behavior. It's not like you can actually change yourself. You can actually improve yourself, and started trying to do the things in the book. And very quickly I was like waking up at 5:30 in the morning and getting, all this extra work done before class. And I was like drinking a little bit less, and I was exercising more, and I started exploring this entrepreneurship stuff. Like that book really changed a lot in my life and gave me this deep appreciation for the truth that there is knowledge in a lot of books that you can use to improve your life if you're willing to do the work. And that set me on a path of trying to read every nonfiction book that might have useful advice and trying to get all of it, which went for 6, 7, 8 years after that.
From the same changing your world philosophy view, or your worldview rather. If we zoom out from that, from solely books and to all types of writings like Paul Graham, I mean, so what do you think differentiates writings which like change people's worldviews versus ones that are not able to do that?
Well, first, the author has to have an interesting worldview themselves. And most people who are writing are not necessarily presenting a whole new worldview. They might be just repackaging something they've read elsewhere. And there's always a certain amount of repackaging in any writing. There's no like truly novel ideas, but the more you are synthesizing a lot of things into a new kind of argument or a new take, especially on like a more modern issue, the more novelty you're bringing into what you're saying, and the more opportunity there is for that worldview to deeply impact someone else. And so that's one half of it. But then the other half is how well can you write, right? So how much can you actually draw the reader in, and how well can you argue for your points? And I think what Paul Graham does such a great job of is his essays are so clearly argued and very logical, very program-like in their points, that he can talk about things in such a clear and focused way that makes his ideas much easier to understand and adopt and to, go forward into the world with. And you really have to have both. You have to have this different worldview from your experiences and from everything you've read, and you have to have the ability to communicate it. And that combination can be rare to find.
George Orwell, 1984.
Yeah.
I mean, but like that was an extreme worldview, but he was able to transfer that worldview to so many people.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think was he able to do that? If you have read 1984.
Yeah, that's a wonderful example too, because oftentimes nonfiction is not the best way to transmit an idea, because the number of people who will sit down and read a Paul Graham essay is actually very small. It seems very large because we're exposed to so many people who like that, but it's a relatively small portion of the whole reading populace, right? The way most people learn new ideas is through stories. And stories are one of the most effective way to transmit ideas. And yes, a story is inefficient because it might take a 300-page story to convey an idea that you could fit on an index card. But that's actually efficient because the story immerses the reader in a world where they get to like fully adopt the idea. And 1984 is this wonderful example because in the middle of 1984, there's that little like essay, that dossier, whatever, that the protagonist finds.
Yeah.
And that actually explains the whole philosophy that Orwell is trying to get across in the book. But if he just published that, nobody would have read it. It wouldn't have gone anywhere. But you wrap it in this very interesting story, in this very interesting world with Big Brother and, the excesses of, totalitarianism and propaganda and monitoring and like all these things. And it's like, oh, cool. This is like a really interesting world. I'm really immersed in it. I'm really invested in the character. Like, what's going to happen to him? Is he going to get out of this? Is he going to rise up against him? And then you like get a little philosophy stuck in along the way. And then you get back to the story. It's such a smart way to package it that let it reach tens of millions of people since it was published compared to the maybe like 10,000 people who would have read the pure essay version.
That's what you've done too, I'd say, in Crypto Confidential.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. That was the goal from the outset with Crypto Confidential was I wanted to write a book that could explain, one, what was cool about crypto to normal people who knew nothing about it, but almost more importantly, explain that, yes, there are a lot of bad actors. Yes, there are a lot of scams. Yes, there is this casino element to it. Like, yes, all those things are true. And there are cool, real things going on. And you can't write the whole space off entirely. You can't be like a doe-eyed religious zealot and think that all of it is gold. You have to learn to tell the difference. And it's going to become more and more important to be able to tell the difference as this industry gets bigger and bigger. And so I knew that if that was the goal, if the goal was to give a crypto education and show people that difference, if I wanted that to reach a mass market, it had to be a really fun story to read. It had to just, it had to be like a thriller. It had to be like something you could read on the beach or like a James Patterson novel or something. And so that's why most of it is narrative. It's fun, it's exciting. And then it has the little education sprinkled in along the way. So it kind of like sneaks into your brain as you're going.
If you talk about specifically about the storytelling aspect of it, how do you do that same thing, which is the biggest problem? Stories are good when they're 300 pages long, but if you have to convey ideas like on a day-to-day basis, no one is going to read your story. How do you do that for those shorter stints of writing?
Yeah, for shorter stints, you can use a shorter story, obviously, right? And what I actually find most effective is whenever I'm trying to explain something or trying to communicate something, I try to find a story from my life that I can use to communicate it. Because, one, so I could give you a few examples here. Let's say that I'm trying to convince you that doing work that you don't care about just to make money is not going to make you happy. I could just say that. I could say doing work to make a lot of money is not going to make you happy, even if you get the money. And most people are going to go like, yeah, maybe. Yeah, like, okay, I've heard that before, but they'll kind of like forget about it, right? Or they might not take it seriously. They'll be like, oh yeah, sure, you say that, but that doesn't apply to me. Another option is I could say like, let me tell you the story of, I'm just going to make a story up, like JP Morgan, right? Like JP Morgan worked his whole life and he made all of this money, but he was estranged from his family and, died alone. Like, I don't know if that's true at all. I'm just making something up to be clear. Right. But like, that's a little bit effective, right? Because now you're like, oh, I don't want to be like JP Morgan. He was top of the game and he was removed from his family or whatever. Right. But I actually think it's most effective if I say like, look, I sacrificed everything to make as much money as humanly possible in the course of a year. And I kind of got what I wanted. It went from this like, much smaller point to like, at one point the crypto net worth on paper was like over $10 million. And I was miserable. I like wasn't sleeping. Me and my partner were like having fights all the time. I wasn't present with my newborn. Like I didn't like who I was. It had all of these awful effects that I can go into depending on like how much time I have with the person to tell this story. But me standing there saying like, this happened to me. Like I went through this and, I realized that like that little, that quippy line is actually true. I think that sticks with the listener or the reader the best because they're getting a deeper relationship with you. You're going to bring a lot more emotion to the story because it's your story. And if you don't have a story to back up what you're trying to say from your life, then like maybe you shouldn't be the one trying to convince somebody of that anyway, right? Like you're just regurgitating somebody else's advice, which like you don't need to do. Other people are giving out enough advice already.
the most important thing I'd say when you transmit ideas that you have and that the other person does not have and you want to explain it to them, the biggest problem that I run into when trying to do that is context. Like the context which has been built upon for that idea for me, it's very tough to transmit that context to the other guy or the other girl.
That's a really important point. And I think this is why a book that is life-changing for you might have no impact on somebody that you recommend it to, because you often have to read a book at just the right time for the ideas to be very useful to you. So, like Power of Habit had this very deep impact on me when I read it in that place in my life and when I was in that situation. But I think that if I started reading it today, I wouldn't get through the first 10 or 20 pages, because I would say like, I've already heard a bunch of this stuff. Like, I know how to like get in shape. I know how to do these things like this, this isn't it. In the same way that like when I read Atlas Shrugged, I was taking some of my first economics classes in high school. And so I had never thought about money, and I'd never thought about human behavior and incentives and things around money at all. But I was suddenly taking these classes and learning some of these concepts. And then I discovered this philosophy around human behavior and money as a tool for like understanding human behavior. And it kind of like, it showed up at just the right time to have that kind of impact. And so I think you're totally right. Like the context of the information or the advice or the knowledge has to be right for the other person too. Like another good example of this that I'll give is sometimes people reach out to me and they'll say, hey, I'm thinking of like going and doing the nomad thing. I want to go travel and live out of my backpack and work from cafes and stuff. And what I'll often say is like, go do it. If you want to do it, like you should totally go do it, but it's probably not going to make you happy. And when you start to feel like maybe this was an empty promise or whatever, like reach out to me again and like, then let's talk. Because if you have that itch, you should totally go do it. You should scratch that itch, because otherwise you'll wonder for the rest of your life if you would have been happy doing that. But once you start to realize that like, maybe this isn't it, like then what I have to say about the topic is going to hit a lot more than if I tried to convince you that that's not a happy life before you went and tried it.
How do you boil down all your context that you have for that specific idea and transmit it to that person, if I'm talking that?
It's a great question. I don't know that you can. I think the best that you can do is just try to find the right story to tell them and then hope that it lands. And if it doesn't, like that's okay too. And I always try to couch it, or, I try to qualify the advice too and say, this for my situation and in my background and everything. And, this is what worked for me. But you kind of have to also assume that somebody who's receiving information or receiving advice is smart enough to realize that they've got to get it from a few places, and they've got to kind of figure out what to take and what to leave from the different sources. And so you don't have to try to create the perfect context for them, because you're just giving them like one data point in them trying to like shape their worldview around a topic.
Do you try to do that though?
Only to the extent that I try to find the best story to convey the information with. I think that's the best I can do. I can't do all of the work for them, right? But I can try to package it the best way I can and deliver it that way. And if it works for them, great. If not, like that's okay too.
When you try to build that context over time, how do you think like you talked about some books being better for you when you're younger, but being, for lack of a better word, useless to you now? Mm-hmm. How does that context development really happen?
It's just reading a lot. Like, you start, I think that it's natural, especially if you're in the nonfiction train, you start off by reading these like very punchy, very tactical books, right? These ones that like give you clear solutions to your problems. And then after a while, you start to realize that a lot of them are saying fundamentally the same things if you get a little bit simpler. And so you start to look for that like simpler layer, right? It's like, what's actually behind a lot of these books? And you realize there's actually a lot fewer ideas at that layer. And then you spend some time there and you say like, well, what's behind these ideas? You go a bit lower, and kind of everything eventually resolves to like philosophy or religion. And there is an element of like, if you can just study the very foundational philosophical, religious, and like stories as well, you do get a bit of a like bedrock foundation to understand everything else a lot quicker. And it also makes you skeptical of certain things that don't have a foundation, right? So, as one example, there's all of these pop psych books that have been very popular for the last 10 or 15 years, right? And well, we could use like Mindset by Carol Dweck as an example. Like there are good ideas in that book around having the right mindset and believing that change is possible and not being fixed and all of these things. But those ideas aren't really new. They're really old, right? Like it's 2,000-year-old philosophy. It's stuff you can find in the Bible, right? Like you could get those ideas elsewhere. And then all the attempts to prove them have kind of failed because a lot of the like published science in those books ends up not replicating or ends up not being very reliable. And they try to like deduce a bunch of extra things that just don't end up being true. And so if you're reading one of those books and you don't have that foundation, you'll just believe everything equally because it's all in this book and it all has, some study backing it up. But if you have that foundation, you'll understand that, okay, some of this stuff we already know and some of this stuff might be right, might be wrong. Like we're going to have to wait and see. But you could almost just like skip reading the book entirely because you already have the foundational understanding. So you might not need this like new, research-based layer on top of it because a lot of the like fundamental ideas about human nature and striving and things like those don't change that much over time.
I totally agree with that. But if like all the ideas like boil down to the same fundamental concepts and ideas, why are some writers or some people with those same ideas, why are they more why do they have more advocacy over those ideas as compared to others who are using that same idea?
I think it's just that this is like a hard thing to keep in mind sometimes, is that like somebody who you fundamentally disagree with on big political, philosophical, religious, whatever issues, you'd probably agree with them if you had all of the same like upbringing, context, situations, whatever that they have. It's like, humans are pretty reasonable in general, right? And they like respond to their environment and their environment shapes their worldview and their relationships and all of these things. And so it would be natural to pick the few ideas that have resonated the most with you and focus your energy there and not try to like talk about everything. And it would be natural to think that those ideas are more correct because in your experience, they are more correct, right? Like that's what's worked out for you in your life. But the truth is that there are an almost infinite basket of ideas that could be like right, or that could be the ones that work out for someone. And it's really on everybody to do the work to figure out what that basket of ideas is or are for them, and be able to pull from a bunch of different sources to like craft that worldview instead of just like grabbing a random one and taking it on wholesale.
Do you think, does paraphrasing make a difference too?
Yeah, I mean, that'll certainly affect how people adopt it and whether people believe it or not. So it's a really important thing to understand when you're trying to present a point, right? There's a really good book on this called Words That Work by Frank Luntz that talks all about how making tiny changes in your word choice can make people more likely to agree with you or disagree with you. And it's a very powerful tool when you understand it correctly. So you can say the same thing about paraphrasing, right? It's like the way you try to condense an idea can make it more or less palatable depending on the audience you're talking to. And sometimes that's a really important skill to have because, for example, if I'm on a podcast talking to someone who doesn't know much about crypto, and if their audience doesn't know much about crypto, I'm going to paraphrase things a lot to try to make it as simple and approachable as possible. And a lot of the things that I'll say might be like technically incorrect, right? Because it's not a sufficiently detailed explanation, but it's good enough to like bootstrap understanding so that you can get to like the full understanding later.
When you write somewhere for people who are like non-crypto people, for example,
Yeah.
who you use a different kind of writing style for them, and then if you were to transmit those same ideas for people who are people who have knowledge about crypto, does that shift your consistency in your form of writing?
Yeah, it'll definitely affect how it's written, right? And I think that's one of the most important things you have to ask before writing something is, who is this for, right? Like, who do I expect to read this, or who do I want to read this? And then you're going to have to tailor your writing style to fit that, right? Because if you want to have a mass market, mega successful book, then it has to be written in a certain way that appeals to a mass market. If you write a super literary, dense, slow and intricate style novel, that's not going to have the same appeal as a Stephen King horror thriller that is like fast and punchy and exciting and whatnot. And if you write one but expect the success of the other, you're going to be very disappointed, right? You've really got to know, who you're writing for, how to write for them, and then what kind of outcomes you can reasonably expect from that. Because if you mismatch those, then you're going to produce bad work and you're going to be disappointed by it.
How do you plan your writing process?
Yes, so it's something that's still evolving. I'm still figuring out how to do it. I had to learn how to do it for a book when I started this, of course. I'd never written something, like this that was book length and that was narrative driven. So I had to experiment a lot. And I tried everything. I tried doing the outline just in bullet points. I tried doing it with note cards on the floor. I've tried doing an outline in a Notion database. I had to play around with it a lot. And what I've actually found is that like a very visual style of outlining is very helpful for me, where, I know the overarching arc of the story that I want to tell. And so from that, I can figure out some of the main points, right? Like I can figure out what the introduction would be. I can figure out what the inciting incident would be. I can figure out, the midpoint, the climax, the resolution. And then from those, I can figure out, okay, these are some of the scenes that have to happen in the first act. These are the scenes that have to happen in the middle. These are the scenes that have to happen in the end. And it kind of like trickle down into greater and greater complexity from there until I know the, call it 50, 70, 80 scenes that are going to comprise the book. And then I just have to like hop in and start writing them. And of course, once you start writing, you realize that your outline isn't quite right. You've got to tweak things. And so you kind of keep adjusting it as you go. But taking that time to start at like the highest, simplest level and continually break it down to more and more detail before starting writing it all is extremely helpful for like not getting stuck and for always knowing where you're going. Because I think a lot of writer's block happens from just not knowing where you're going, not knowing what to do next. But if you always know the next like checkpoint that you're writing towards, it's a lot easier to be very consistent every day. When I write an article, I sort of just freeball it. Like I just start writing and figure it out as I go. I don't plan it out in advance. And I might put like a few bullet points at the bottom, 5, 6, 7, 8 points that I want to make sure I hit. And then I just write until it's done and maybe do a round or two of editing and put it out there. I used to plan my articles a lot more, but I think from writing so many of them, it's gotten a lot easier and making a pretty deliberate choice that I wanted to focus on book writing. And so to the extent that I do article writing, it can't become a huge time investment, or at least it can't become a huge time investment too often. So I'm willing to be a little less particular on how that's done.
When do you know is it done?
I mean, there's a great line from Da Vinci that art is never finished, it's only abandoned. And I think that that's true. Like you could keep editing a book infinite times, right? You could always find something to tweak. You could always keep rereading it. You could always keep, adding chapters, removing chapters, changing words. But I think of progress on any creative project as like a log curve, right? So, going from 0 to the first draft, you might be 50% of the way there. And then the next draft you're 75, and then you're 87.5, and then you're 93 or whatever. And at some point you just have to say like, okay, that's good enough, right? And maybe for some people it's good enough at 75%. For some people it's not good enough until it's at 99%. And you have to figure out, where you want to be on that curve with your work. And I'm probably at the I like the 95% range because I want to be really, really proud of it, but I'm not going to do 2 more drafts just to make it 1 or 2% better. It's it's already good enough at that point. But that also means that, I can't churn out books as quickly as people who, write very formulaic novels for Kindle, and they publish 4 or 5 books a year, but they're not very good books, right? They're just kind of thrown together. They're getting to 50%. They say, yeah, fuck it, ship it. Let's start on the next one. I don't want to do that, but people read them and buy them and enjoy them, and they enjoy writing them. So I'm not being critical of it. That's fine too. You just got to know where you are on that curve, how many times you're willing to keep going back to it before you just say, okay, good enough, right? It's never done. It's always just good enough at some point.
Yeah, Derek said that he said sort of the same thing, that it's there's the reason why nothing is ever complete. You use the word release for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Releases. Yeah, that's a really good way to put it.
How do you be obsessive with it but still be good at it without it being good enough, or with it being good enough?
By always having something else to work on. So by knowing the next book that I want to write, there's a certain excitement to finishing the book that I'm working on, right? And in some ways, the best way to get better, if my goal is to keep getting better and keep writing better books. And at some point, you just can't make the book that you're working on much better without scrapping it and starting over, right? I've gotten better at writing since I wrote Crypto Confidential because I've been doing all this fiction work. And so if I could start over and rewrite Crypto Confidential today and it would be a better book, but I don't want to do that. It's good as it is, right? It's a good book and I'm happy with it. And the way that I get better is by saying okay, this is about as good as this book is going to get. And so now I move on to the next book and I want the next book to be even better. But where you start kind of sets the floor and ceiling for how good that project can be. And after a certain point, the only way you make it better is by throwing it away and starting over. And sometimes that makes sense. Sometimes you do want to do that, but a lot of times you just say okay, I'm ready to release that and just go on to the next thing. But always having the next thing that you're going to do and that you're excited about is very helpful for being able to be done with something. When I turned in Crypto Confidential, I turned it in on October 15th, or I think, which was a Friday. And then the next Monday I started on the sci-fi novel. I didn't take a break at all. I was just I just want to take my mind off of it. I want to keep writing, but I want to work on something entirely different. And so I just got to work on that. And that was great because I could immediately start using a lot of the things that I had learned while working on Crypto Confidential, but in this entirely new project where I had the freedom to start from the beginning again.
How do you know you've gotten better?
I think that if you read a lot and you care about writing quality, you care about book quality, you develop a certain degree of taste in your mind. You can tell what's good and bad, or at least what you like and dislike. And the hardest thing as a writer or any creator is being stuck in the gap between what is good and what you like and appreciate and what you are able to do. And you might be stuck, everybody's stuck in some amount of that gap. You're never as good as what you see as great work, but you can at least look at parts of your work and be well, this is closer and this is further away, right? This is better than this. And over time, you can start to feel that gap getting closer. You can start to be oh, I've actually figured this thing out that I didn't know how to do before. And I don't have to worry about that anymore. When I started doing Crypto Confidential, I had no idea how to structure a scene in a story, an actual scene in a part of the book. I had no idea how to do it. And so it was a total mess. The things didn't flow naturally. but I spent a lot of time practicing that and I got pretty good at it. And now I have a really good grasp on scene structure. I'm not worried about that anymore. And when I read my work, I can say like, oh, cool. Like I'm not worried about the scene. Like the scene's good, but now I need to get better at this other thing. And so now I can read it for that. And so you're just constantly kind of like checking things off your like skill checklist. It's like a video game, right? Like, okay, you made 1,000 like bronze swords and now you can like graduate to iron, right? You're like, you're moving through these little skill levels and you stop having to worry about some of the earlier ones as you go, and you just keep finding new ways to get better.
You talking about, I mean, great one. That I'll go back to the first thing you talked about, taste. What does taste really mean?
That's a great question. To me, it means being able to explain what is so good about something that other people also enjoy, but can't explain the goodness of. Because like everybody can sit down at a 3 Michelin star restaurant and have one of the dishes and realize it tastes good. But if you actually have really good taste in food, then you can say that, oh, well, they used this ingredient, which is providing this certain amount of like acid relative to this other ingredient that's very basic. That's creating this like nice contrast on your palate. And then there's this like brightness over here that's kind of adding like a pop layer. You're able to like talk about it in that way. And so like for me, when I read writing, I can very easily point out little things the writer is doing to make the scene, more exciting or scarier, or make the writing more compelling, or I can point out where it's failing in some of those ways. And where somebody else might read a passage and say like, oh, that didn't work for me, or oh, I got bored. Like I can maybe say like this specific thing is what's causing that like bad taste in somebody's mouth. And the more of those things you can point to in a given like art form, kind of the better your like taste is. And you could even take this in another direction, which is like, if you can actually enjoy very challenging expressions of art in ways that other people cannot, like that's also a form of taste, right? Like, a Jackson Pollock painting is a good example here because it looks like he just threw a bunch of paint at the wall, right? Like, it just looks like a mess. But then if you understand how incredibly challenging it actually is to create those patterns the way he's creating them, you develop this like incredible new appreciation for his art in a way that you never would if you just dismissed it as throwing paint at the wall. Same thing with writing, right? It's like there's incredibly literary, complicated, tough to get through books that most people just won't enjoy. But if you have a certain degree of taste, you might really enjoy them because you're seeing like what the writer's trying to do, what new thing they're trying, what idea they're communicating in a novel way, what emotion they're making you feel. And that book might have a much smaller audience, but the people who read it really, really deeply appreciate what the author did in it.
How does somebody develop that taste? Is it only through experience, or like can it be developed without experience?
Yeah, I think consumption is obviously the most important part. You've got to, if we'll stick with books, you've got to read a ton, and you have to read a ton of different books in different areas, different skill levels, different, intensities. You can't just read like pop business nonfiction, right? You'll never develop good taste in books if that's all of you read. But if you're reading, philosophy and religion, and you're reading thrillers and literary fiction and like romance and fantasy and sci-fi, like if you're reading a big breadth of things at different quality levels, you'll start to pick up on the differences between them, right? Like, if you go have a McDonald's hamburger and then have a, $30 hamburger from like a fancy place in the city, you'll start to be able to pick up on what exactly is making those two things different, right? Like the bread feels different in your mouth, right? Like you can even like squeeze it and you can see that it responds differently. The cheese has like this subtle difference in the palate. Like the meat, when you cut into it, you can see the actual quality of the sinew holding it together. Like the accoutrements are going to be different with the pickles and whatever. Like you're going to start to notice these tiny things that are making the difference. And the more you're able to pick out the differences between like the bottom tier and the top tier, the more you'll be able to see everything in between as well.
If you look at it that way, isn't taste a relative term rather than being an absolute thing?
Yes, because there's always going to be some personal preference involved. And there is a certain objectivity to taste where, everybody who's a, incredible chef will agree that a top tier burger is going to taste better and have a more interesting palate experience than a McDonald's burger. But they will disagree on which of the top tier burgers is the best because they have different preferences and things. So it kind of has both elements, right? Like there is an element of objectivity. Some food is just better than other food. Like some coffee is just better than other coffee. Like some wine is just better than other wine. Some books are just better written than other books. But once you get up, especially into that like tier of greatness, what's better than, which things are better than other things, that becomes very subjective.
What really goes up that tier of greatness versus what stays down?
The way it happens is that there are taste makers who are early on things and who try the stuff at the fringe, right? Because there's always the realm of safety, the things that the people have just generally agreed on are good. And then there's all the new stuff popping up around the fringe. And then tastemakers who are very invested in this area try all the new things at the fringe. And then they try to tell the normies like what's good. And if the tastemakers think it's good, they can communicate why it's good and people then agree with them that it's good. Then I think it starts to move into that more like objective tier. But if you have something that like a few tastemakers are obsessed with and love, but it never breaks out of their like little niche, then it's hard to say like, is it objectively good? Is it just like a weird thing that these people like, right? It gets a little bit murkier there, but there's always going to be people who are like on the frontier of any art form, trying the new things and then reporting back on whether they're good or not.
I think this has been incredible. I learned a lot from this and I got to get some ideas off of my head too.
Yeah, it was fun. These are great questions. I love talking about them.
Yeah, I'm glad. One question which I like to end with is like, I've been into startups, VCs, like books and writings and all these things that like, 11. What do you think is one fact that'll blow 11-year-old me mind?
What is one fact that would blow the 11-year-old you's mind?
Yep.
I love this one, which is that like literally everything around you, from the biggest skyscrapers to like a pen on your desk, it's like that's only there because somebody decided at some point to make it and to bring it into the world. And so there are all of these just like infinite things surrounding you every day that some unknown person decided to create. And through their like energy and determination and creativity and resourcefulness, like they made that a thing in the world. And so like you also have that power if you choose to accept it and make the most of it. Like there's just infinite opportunity for creation, and everything great that you enjoy in the world exists because somebody wanted to create it at some point. So you may as well go try to create something great too.
That blows 15-year-old me mind. I'm so glad we got the chance to do this. Thank you so much for taking the time out for this. And I feel like great book again.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
And I think that's it from my side. Anything you'd like to say?
No. Thank you so much for having me on. This is a lot of fun. It was a great chat. And hopefully we talk again sometime soon.